Thanks so much, Jill. I'm definitely gonna have to give Applique a try. All right, so I'm Christopher Thompson, the tattooed quilter, and I'm excited to show you how to foundation paper piece our little blue bird. Here's the block right here. It's super cute, isn't it? So I used a mix of our Hush Hush low volume collection, as well as Shabby, one of our basics by Lori Holt, as well as Blossom by yours truly. Okay, so some of the things that you're gonna need to do your block, to make your block are, you're gonna need some little snips just in case you have to snip a thread. Obviously you're gonna need rotary cutters to cut your fabric. I'm using 50 weight thread in white, a little ruler, as well as a mechanical pencil. And then of course you're going to need your pattern. And you can find the pattern on our website, RileyBlakeDesigns.com, under free patterns. Okay, so when you go to print your pattern, what you're gonna do is you're gonna wanna make sure that you print your pattern templates at 100%. And a good way to check that out is by taking your ruler and using the little box here. You wanna make sure that that measures 1 inch. So I'm gonna place that there. And I'm good to go. If it was less than 1 inch, you would be in trouble because your pattern pieces wouldn't line up. And that's not what we want, right? Okay, so I'm good at 1 inch. Foundation paper piecing is a bit scary, and I will say this block is a little bit more complex than some other foundation paper piece patterns out there. But if you practice, I know that you can make this block. So what I like to do is, I'm gonna move this guy over here, is I like to cut out my templates. And I usually keep an extra rotary cutter next to me that's just for paper. That way I'm not using my fabric rotary cutter. And what I do is I just carefully go in and cut out the templates. And they're all lettered and numbered, and those are the sections. The pattern is by one of our designers, Christy Lee of A Quiet Play. And what she does in the instructions is she tells you the order that you're gonna be sewing and joining all of the templates together. So for example, this is A, this is B, C, D, E, etc. And that's great so that you don't forget in which order that you're gonna sew. So I just carefully cut around the lines. And the nice thing is with this foundation paper piece template is the seam allowance is already built into it. So that's fantastic. Okay, so once you have your templates cut out, the next thing that I like to do is write on them the direction of the bird or the order of the fabrics. That way I won't forget. So for example, on the pattern, you could see here each section is lettered. And then, so for example, this is B, so this is section B here. So what I'll do is B1, that's this big piece here, that's the bird. So I will just write bird. That way I'll remember which fabric goes where. And then et cetera, et cetera. So then up here, these are all background, so I would probably write BKG for background, BKG, BKG. This is background down here. And I would do that on each section, that way I won't forget. Another helpful tip is you could print out an additional template and you could write it all on that template so that you'll remember. You could also keep track of the fabrics you're using by stapling a piece of the fabric to that template as well. And that way you'll never forget. Okay, so once I have it all cut out and I've labeled everything, what I do now is I cut my fabric. Some foundation paper piece templates will tell you exactly what size fabric you need for that section of the unit. Christy didn't, and that's totally okay, because this is a small enough block that you could measure and figure it out yourself. So all you do is you take your ruler and you take your template, and you want to make sure that you give yourself, and this is totally the method that I love to do. It's a little bit more wasteful, but I know that I have a little bit more room to not mess up. So I just take my ruler and I give myself about a ½ inch more than I need beyond the seam allowance, the outside seam allowance. So for example, here, I'm probably gonna cut at least 5 3/4 or 6 inches wide. And then I wanna make sure that you're covering this entire section here. So I'm gonna give myself another ½ inch there. So that looks like about 4. And another thing that you could do is you could also write on here the size of the fabric that you need. That way, if you want to go back and make this template again, you'll know exactly the measurements that you need. And so I will just measure each section of the unit, so D1, D2, D3, in the fabrics that I'm using for the block. And I've already done that. So here are my fabrics. And remember, with foundation paper piecing, it's numbered, and that's the order that you're going to sew the pieces of fabric together to make the unit. The other thing that you have to remember with foundation paper piecing is that you're putting wrong side of the fabric to the wrong side of the paper. That was probably the hardest thing that I had to discover when I first learned how to do foundation paper piecing. But once you get the hang of it and practice, it's easy peasy. Okay, so wrong side of fabric, wrong side of paper. And this is D1, and this fabric is my background, so that's D1. And then I need to find my D2. And what I've noticed here is there's a little bit more fabric than I actually need, so I'm just going to trim this up so it's not so bulky when I go to take it to the sewing machine. And this is great because I can use this for another little small section of the block later. Okay, and then D2 is my bird. So here's another fun step to foundation paper piecing, is when you're joining the other piece of fabric to the other fabric, they're actually right sides together. So find D2, and what I do is I make sure that the fabric for D2 is 1/4 inch away from this line right here. Because we're actually going to be sewing on this line, I want to make sure that D2, the bird fabric, is 1/4 inch away, so that covers my seam allowance. And that looks pretty good. Oops, it slipped a little bit. You could also use a little bit of a glue stick to hold down your first fabric. Totally pulls apart and it's washable. So, okay, so my seam allowance is used. I'm just using the light here in the studio, but you could use your window light, you could use a light box, whatever you find helpful to be able to see that seam allowance. Okay. And now I'm going to take this over to the sewing machine and sew on that line. So I've preset my sewing machine with a 90-14 needle. That's my personal preference when doing foundation paper piecing. My thread, and then I've adjusted my stitch line to 1.4, because the smaller the stitch line, the easier it will be to remove the paper when you are done putting your block together. And then I always start outside the outside seam allowance. That just secures all the fabric together, so when you go to cut that seam allowance in, your fabric isn't going to move or flop around. And then you're just sewing right on that line. And then I'm going to stop a little bit outside that line. Again, that just secures the fabric. Take it over to your cutting mat. And now you're going to build in your seam allowance. So you flip the paper over, creasing where you've just sewn, and then you're going to trim 1/4 inch away. You're just going to put your 1/4 inch line there from your ruler on the fabric, trim that away, and that's all the waste that you have. You could also use an add 1/4 ruler, and what that does is it has a built-in little lip that goes right up against your paper and your fabric, and you get a perfect 1/4 inch every time. But because I've done this for so long, I don't need that ruler. Okay, so then I'm going to take it over to my iron, and I have my iron and my quilter's clapper. I love to use these for foundation paper piecing, and I'm using my iron without any steam in it. So I'm just going to flip over the bird part. Okay, just give that a good press. And then what I would typically do at home if I was making several of these blocks, I would use my quilter's clapper, put it on this block, and I would go and make another section of the block. Or if I was chain piecing the same section for multiple blocks, I would just leave my quilter's clapper on here. It makes those seams so nice and flat. They're amazing. But I'm going to keep doing this block. So next, I need D3, which is a background piece, and I have that already cut. And you're doing the same thing, so it's right sides to right sides. And you're making sure that you're following the line on the template. making sure that you have a 1/4 inch seam allowance. And I can kind of see here it's sticking out just a little bit, and I can kind of tell that that is enough for a 1/4 inch seam allowance. And you just take it back over to your machine and do the same thing. Stitching right on that line. And again, I'm going to keep going because I want it to cover the outside seam allowance. And here's the tricky part that sometimes happens is when you're done sewing, you bring it back over to your cutting mat, sometimes this will flip up. And then you go like this and you go to cut and you've just cut right into that piece that you need for the unit. So you just want to make sure that you always have it nice and flat and you double check that there's no fabric hanging out. And if it is, that's okay. You can totally take your snips and you can just gently cut the thread out so you're not tearing the paper and remove that piece of fabric and start over. Okay, so we're going to cut in our 1/4 inch seam allowance. Throw away our scraps. Go over to our ironing board and press that back. There is some bias in this block, so you want to be careful that you're not stretching the fabric too much. And again, you can use the quilter's clapper, put it on there, and it'll make all the seams nice and flat. Okay, so that was the last unit of this block. You can see here that I've already completed A, B, and somewhat of C. We just did D together, and then here's E with its little legs. Those little legs are so cute, those little chicken legs, those little bird legs. So what I'm going to show you now is how to cut your seam allowance. So you can see here that I have all this extra fabric even way outside the seam allowance. So what you need to do is you need to trim the block. And what you're going to do is you're going to put your ruler along this outside line, making sure that you're not cutting into that 1/4 inch seam allowance, and you're going to trim. And you're going to keep going. And I might need a little bit of a bigger ruler, but I think I can make this work. Also, be very careful when you're using these small rulers that you don't slip and slice a knuckle. And you can see here that there's an angle here, so you want to follow these angles because that's super important when piecing this block together. Oops. And again, you want to make sure that you keep that 1/4 inch outside seam allowance because that's going to really help you. Oh, there, see, missed that one, but I was able to fix it. Okay, and then I'm going to do the same for the block that we made together. Okay, so now I have C and D cut. And you can see here how they're going to look together in the block. So cute. All right, the next step is sewing these pieces together. Now, if this was a less complicated block, I would probably go ahead and remove the paper. But because there's some tricky angles in this block, and tricky in a good way, I'm actually going to leave the paper in. So let me show you how I do this. So in the order that you sew based on the pattern, she wants you to do A and B together first, C and D, and then you're going to join A and B to C and D, and then E and then F. That's how you're going to complete the block. But I'm going to skip A and B and show you C and D because it's a little bit more interesting. So right sides together. Your angled pieces, the flat bottom part here, this is D, is going to line right up with C, the bottom of C. And the same with the top part. And you want to make sure that it's nice and flat and flush together. And then instead of using pins, what I like to use, because there's multiple layers of seams and paper and fabric, I'm actually going to use my binding clips to hold all of this together. Because I find that it's a little bit more secure than pins. Because with pins, once you're going into the paper and all the fabric, it will shift. And this one doesn't quite line up like I want it to. And sometimes it takes a minute to get it lined up. There we go. And then because I'm extra, I'm going to put an extra binding clip in there. And then you're going to take it to your sewing machine and you're going to sew. And I'm going to follow the line. That's all I'm going to do. I'm going to start 1/4 of an inch this way, and I'm going to follow that line. And I'm going to keep the stitch length the same. Now, you could go in and do a basting stitch and follow that line and then open it to make sure all of the inside seams match up. I'm going to risk it and not do it and see what happens. And if I have to rip it out, I have to rip it out. Okay, we're just following that line. And you want to make sure everything stays nice and lined up. And you can go pretty slow. You don't have to go super fast. Again, just making sure fabric, paper, all of that stays together. And then you're just going to keep sewing that 1/4 inch and go all the way off of the 2 units that are together. Okay, here goes. Let's see if it all lined up. It did pretty good. The tail didn't quite line up, but that's okay because my outside around the fabric, that all is pretty well lined up. So when I go to join everything together, it's going to be good. And I'm okay with the tail not being perfect there. Okay, so then because C and D are done, A and B are done, then you're just going to join them together using the same method. Then you're going to join E and then F. Now, here's a hot tip for you. Paper, when you go to remove the paper, sometimes what I'll do, especially if I'm sewing a more intricate pattern, I will remove the fabric along the seam allowance. That just makes it easier when you're working with tearing the paper out. It's much easier to pull the paper out. If I was doing this, joining A and B to C and D, I would probably go ahead and remove the papers from D because there's nothing touching that, so you don't really need to keep those in. And if you want, you can give this a press now, or after you've removed all the papers, you can give it a good press. Use the quilter's clapper, and the block will come out nice and flat. So let's take a look at our finished block again. He is so cute, you guys. I used multiple hush hush prints for the backdrop. I thought it was really fun. And what I tried to do was to keep most of the bird in one print and then use a different print here where his little beak is at. And then the top and bottom are another print. And then I used one more print here where his little feet are at. But it's totally up to you. It's a lot of fun to do this. And again, practice makes perfect. So if you're nervous about foundation paper piecing, find an easy breezy foundation paper piecing template, practice, and then download this one and have so much fun with it. All right, be sure to check out Hush Hush. That's our Follow the Bluebird campaign happening right now. And I can't wait to see all the awesome things you make. Thanks for joining us.